Okay, welcome to the FantasyLabs podcast. This is Bryan. I'm here with Jay, and we're continuing our MLB GPP series. Jay, what's going on, dude?
Just hanging out, Bryan. Excited to talk about another MLB tournament, but not as excited as I was for that 200-meter final that we just watched Bolt destroy.
Yeah, he's insane. Him and Phelps, just any race, really. Just like for Phelps, anything that's in water, it doesn't matter what he's doing. And Bolt, he can dominate a 100-meter, and apparently you just keep on extending it out, and he'll beat you there too. It's crazy.
It's insane, man. Fastest man alive. And Phelps would be like good at waterboarding somehow or something. he's absurd with water. Yeah, it's crazy.
Phelps is crazy just with all the medals he has. Bolt just is sort of depressing because it never looks like he's trying at all.
It's insane. He just has a dial, man. He knows he's going to win every single time. It's absurd, but I don't know. I know there's been talk about who's a better, who you think is better comparatively, I guess. And I don't know. I know the argument for Bolt is cooler to be the fastest man in the world, and he doesn't have as many opportunities to medal as Phelps, which is pretty big. So I don't know. I'm kind of torn. I think they're both good. Who do you lean?
Yeah, I mean, the stuff. The argument for Bolt is also that anyone can run. Not everyone has access to be able to learn how to do a butterfly stroke and really practice. Whereas everyone can just go to their backyard and sprint 100 meters.
That's why it makes it better. Yeah, that he's the fastest.
Yeah, I don't know. They're so good.
Yeah, I would take either for sure. I'd rather be.
Yeah, I definitely get the argument for Bolt, but it's also okay, well, if that's the case, what would you want Phelps to do to show he's more dominant?
Yeah, it's hard to say he's better than Phelps, but I don't think it's hard to say he's on the same level, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think they're both
equals.
They're both okay.
Yeah, a lot better than me, man, at anything I've ever done.
Those Jamaican runners, man, they're just fast.
They're awesome. Yeah, they crush it.
Men, women, doesn't matter. They're just so fast.
Real fast.
Okay, so we're going to keep on going with our series. This is the 5th week, I believe, and this is going to be tentatively our last week. I think we're going to wrap the series. And if you missed it, we were just picking some tournaments. We started off the very first pod. It didn't count as one of the 5 weeks. We talked about 10 different ways to be contrarian in MLB tournaments, and then we definitely wanted to show what those looked like in application and actual real life tournament. So what we decided to do was for the next however long, and I think it ended up being 5 weeks, is just to pick a different tournament at different entry levels and different buy-ins on both DraftKings and FanDuel, and talk through which contrarian things actually work in tournaments and the process behind those. And I think it's been good. We've gone through low stakes DraftKings tournament, high stakes DraftKings tournaments. We've done a low stakes FanDuel tournament. And we've also done a single entry tournament, so that was unique as well. And then this last week is going to be a high stakes FanDuel tournament. It's going to be the FanDuel Monsters, the $300 buy-in and 297 person tournament. So I think it's useful to do both sites just because the differences between the sites because of the double pitcher and the stacking differences, the 4 and 4. And on DraftKings, you can have 5 up to single team, really makes it very, very different in how how the sharpest people in the industry attack the slates. That, just those rules in general really dictate how they build teams. So I think it's useful to look at low entry and high entry for both sites independently.
Yeah, the sites are so different that it only makes sense to break down these tournaments, even though they're the same buy-ins or similar sizes, even similar prize pools. The actual site scoring, the FanDuel, the weight of the win is huge. 2 pitchers versus 1, of course, and the stacking. So I think there's a lot of strategy that goes into both. I think it's really hard. I'm very impressed with a lot of tournament players that succeed on both sites in tournaments. It's not like you just plug and play the same hitters because the pricing is so different and changes night by night. So it's really hard to play both sites, similar tournaments, and crush on a consistent basis. You really got to focus on one or the other at first, probably, and then once you're kind of comfortable with the strategies in each tournament, you can do both sides.
Yeah, and we have a lot of different available metrics to be able to like figure out where the value is. We have bargain rating, which is just the bargain of a player on DraftKings relative to their FanDuel salary, and vice versa. We have team value rating for MLB, which is just a team's average salary compared to their implied run total. So it just sort of lets you see the Vegas value of that team relative to their average salary, which is a nice way to see where the value is. So we have stuff like that, but actually practically measuring the differences on a daily basis is definitely tough. You know, like you and I are immersed in these all day, and it's still tough for even us. So I definitely don't get discouraged. Use those metrics because I think they're really helpful, but it is tough to, you know, put a lot of volume in on both sides. It is impressive, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, we're breaking this down from last night, Wednesday night slate. It was a 10-game slate.
Yep.
And it was kind of a cool slate in that it made a lot of sense, you could say, kind of the results. The Diamondbacks were highly owned, and they came through. The Dodgers came through outside of Chase Utley, which I feel really bad for people who had Dodger stacks with him, and it's over 5. But you look at the 2 through 5 hitters, and they all crushed. Then you look at the Diamondbacks, of course, their top 4 rosterable hitters outside of Mitch Haniger. I don't think he was available. All came through as well. And then you go to the pitching side, we had Lester and Yu Darvish, both over 20% owned in this tournament, come through huge. So it's kind of a night where the chalk hit, you could say.
Yeah, it did, but there are still some unique ways to be contrarian, and we'll definitely get into those in just a second. Quickly, before we get into it, I do want to talk – this did not end up being the winning lineup, but you and I were talking throughout this tournament. Just we keep notes during the tournament so we could do this podcast. And I can't remember what it was, but for most of the night, a Boston stack was winning. And we thought that was particularly interesting just because of their high implied run total. Boston's always high implied, but their low ownership. And I think it was really interesting just because of the weather. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I think it's a great example that can translate to any slate, any team, and with the primary reason being weather, of course. This was a game in Baltimore that had a very, very high chance of heavy rain, not just a delay, most likely a suspended game possibly, or if they got through a called game, which ultimately ended up being called in the 6th inning. So this is a game and an example of an offense, a high-powered offense in a very favorable ballpark where these guys have had success, and you're getting these guys at 1% ownership. The team we talked about finished in 47th place out of 297. They still cashed. Obviously, you needed some Diamondbacks on this slate to come through, but the fact is that he got value, so much value on these guys with David Ortiz 2% owned, Jackie Bradley Jr. 1% owned, and it was all because of the risk of rain. And while in cash you would never touch these guys, I think perfect example of how to use risk to your advantage in tournaments like this, in large field tournaments, and roster hitters for this game that are underused in other lineups.
Yeah, and these are hitters with a lot of upside. It's not like these were just sort of like mediocre plays. Lefties at Camden is one of the best situations you could target. I mean, it's not Coors or Chase, but lefties at Camden, which was Baltimore's park, it's just a really, really good situation. And just the best lefty team, some of the best lefty batters in the MLB is Boston. You have Ortiz and Jackie Bradley, just guys who crush right-handers, and especially do it at Camden. And then you can pair them with Mookie, who isn't left-handed, but just crushes everyone in general.
Yeah, man.
No matter what arm you pitch with, whether you're right, left-handed, or
Mookie. Yeah. Mookie, my namesake, 10 for 21 with 7 home runs and 13 RBIs in 5 games at Camden this season. So this is a guy, he was 3.7% owned. And I think usually if there were no rain, he'd be quite a bit higher. But that rain scares a lot of people away, rightfully so. This was a game that it was very risky. But this is just one of our examples of how you can leverage that risk to high upside in these tournaments. And I think one thing with this tournament in particular is a $300 buy-in. So I think it's all relative to how much risk you're kind of comfortable with. If you're throwing one lineup in the $300 tournament and stack an offense of a team that is more than likely not going to finish the game and not get their full amount of innings in, then it's a lot more difficult to kind of throw away that $300 or lose very consistently with that strategy in the long run.
Right.
Makes more sense kind of more as a hedge if you're running out multiple apps, but of course in the 300, not a lot of people can really afford that. So I think this is an easier strategy in the $3 tournaments. But at the same time, if you're playing within your bankroll, in these higher stakes tournaments, if you do this, you're going to probably be the only one doing it.
Yeah, and that's where it's sort of hard to judge this. And I think it's actually a better strategy than what the leaderboards are showing, because these guys were so low owned. Jackie Bradley, you're right, was 1% owned, was the fifth hitter, lefty at Camden, and a guy that we know has power. Ortiz, 2% owned. I don't think we need to talk about Ortiz and his power potential. And the only reason that they sort of weren't up the leaderboard is because they were so low owned. Like, literally no lineup had a Boston Diamondback stack. Like, if they did, that probably would have won the tournament, but no one had that because really no one, just so few people had Jackie Bradley and David Ortiz that, we didn't get to see that lineup pump up. But just because that wasn't at the top of the leaderboard doesn't mean that it wasn't a good strategy. It definitely would have been if someone had been able to pair those two combinations. But, it's definitely intriguing. I remember talking to you about this, and I said as a tournament player, I always check the weather, but it's not always to know where to like fade games. It's more like where to embrace risk. And you're right in that if you're only going to throw one line, if you can only afford, like if you've saved up or you want a ticket or something, I understand if you don't want to waste your lineup on a potentially risky game like that. But for sure, like, especially in maybe just a little bit lower, maybe if you're playing like a $25, that's just a little higher than your normal $3 sort of tournament, like a Grand Slam tournament. And that's really a tournament where you could take a lot of risk, and it's not like that huge of a downside if the game either cuts off early. I mean, like they only made 6 innings, but they still had 8 runs,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this kind of goes into a bigger concept and strategy overall in these types of high-stakes tournaments. I think risk is a lot harder to deal with for a lot of players as they gradually move up in stakes.
Yeah.
It's sort of an intuitive feeling to not just theoretically throw away $300 on a team that's likely not going to finish. So what I've noticed with the Monster and the Grand Slam is that really, really good players often win these things. I will get into that in a second with the winning lineup of this one, but they usually have multiple entries so they can better distribute that risk every night. They're comfortable with that risk. They've been doing it a while. So you see a lot of really, really good players take advantage of that and capitalize on leveraging the risk to reach that upside. Whereas a lot of people just getting into these high stakes maybe might lean a bit more towards a cash lineup in these because they don't like just throwing that much money away.
Yeah. And I think this tournament definitely showed that you could still be fairly chalky and put together a good lineup. So let's go through the winning lineup here. So it was won by the Clone, who is a guy that you'll see up on the leaderboards every night. If you play in these high-stakes tournaments, you'll definitely recognize that name pretty quickly. So he had Lester, his pitcher on FanDuel. And I think what was interesting is he had a Texas-Arizona stack. It was almost a 4-4 stack, but he mixed it up a little bit. So he had Lucroy, Beltre, Andrus, and Delino DeShields as his fourth foursome for the Rangers. And then he had Thomas, Ricky Weeks, and Goldschmidt for his Arizona stack. They ended up scoring 13 runs, so it was definitely necessary. When we were just talking about the Boston, to have some sort of Arizona side. Thomas ended up both Thomas and Ricky Weeks ended up having 2 home runs, so that was huge. You sort of just had to have them. But then he mixed it up, and we see this. We actually saw this in the winning lineup with even some of these lower stakes in the Grand Slam. In the squeeze was, you could have a 4, 3, and a 1 stack, and we've talked about stacking 2 teams, and I think that's a really interesting strategy. It's not something we had talked about because we both like a 4-4 stack, and we've talked about it. Just like it gets you upside of these offenses while lowering your risk. You don't have to hit on all the positions, but a 4-3-1 might be a sort of a nice compromise where, if you're leaving a lot of salary on the table and you're uncomfortable with that, or if you feel like one of those final, foursome spots on a team, you're leaving a lot of value from where you could get up to a different guy, then a 4-3-1 I think it's a nice compromise to that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting strategy, and I think it depends on overall roster construction. If you're in need of saving a lot of money at that last position, you just can't fit in the fourth player on that team, which is likely what happened here with Tony Renda being min price as his only player not on Texas or Arizona. So that's a guy who's 2K hitting leadoff, and so that's an example of sacrificing the 4x4 to afford these guys, and then you save salary with another guy in a good spot, at a good spot in the lineup leading off at min price. So I can see it. And yeah, I think it's a way to differentiate, which we've stressed a lot on this pod, on these tournaments. You kind of need to do, but yeah, you're right. I mean, you definitely needed a Diamondback stack on this slate. You needed Yasmani and Weeks. They both ate quite a bit. And then with the Rangers stack. So, I mean, this is our fifth pod. I think like everyone we've done, we break down a tournament and the winning lineup consists of at least one stack, but mostly two stacks.
I think they've been all two stacks. This week was interesting that it had the 4-3-1 FanDuel, but yeah, you're right. It's him going down to Tony Renda for that second base spot. Definitely allowed him to get up to Lester and to get up to some of these other high-priced bats, which was interesting. And I think that's definitely okay. I think it's less that it differentiates your lineup, and I think that's fine if that's what the reason you do it for. But I also think that it's a potential way to get high upside at a position that just maybe not quite. Like if we looked at, I think the Grand Slam had the Grand Slam with the squeeze winning lineup had a 4-3-1 stack, and they ended up switching out the catcher, and it was just because they there's really only like a couple good catchers that on the slate. Grandal and Lucroy were sort of like I think sort of heads above everyone else. So you could stretch on the Arizona stack and go to go switch at the 8th spot, or you could stretch to a guy like David Ross. I don't know, he's in the 8th spot. Like most of these catchers just don't have that much upside. So if you don't want to include like a low upside catcher just to like get your stack in, doing the 4-3, and then if there's a position where it's just really top loaded with two guys that are batting at the top of the order with a lot of power, then you go 4-3 and then one at that position. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And that's definitely a strong strategy. And I think it's just another way to kind of be contrarian within your lineup, which you kind of did need to do on this slate. The Diamondbacks were the highest owned team. They were implied a lot of runs. Tomas was 23% owned. Weeks was 30% owned. And Tomas went for 66. Weeks went for 54. So you're basically eliminated if you didn't have both of them because of those high ownership percentages. Just so much of the field had exposure to these guys that if you faded them, which isn't a bad strategy either, that's just how the slate worked out, but you're just kind of done if you didn't have exposure. I think it's interesting with Yasmani. This is a guy with 12 home runs now in his last 19 games. So it's pretty clear he's on an insane power surge. But something else I want to bring up with him is that it was his 7th multi-home run game, which is something we definitely want to look for when playing these tournaments. And that actually leads the league, 7 multi-home run games. So this is a guy who has as much upside as any hitter in baseball. Do you find yourself kind of targeting these multi-home run upside guys, or is this something you think a lot of people underutilize?
It probably underutilized just because it doesn't show up in stats very often. I mean, like where do you even, other than just like really being into MLB DFS, where do you even come up with that data other than just going on like Baseball Reference and searching for these games, I mean, we know like that, like Mookie has double dong, upside. Like we know, we like, you and I probably know this just from like, like being in baseball all the time, but it was definitely hard to research those type of guys, I think.
And it's really hard to predict, of course. I mean, I think it was Pete on our pods in the beginning of the season who always called a double dong from TJ LeMay like the best hitter in baseball, but just not home run, and certainly very unlikely to double dong. But I think it is important to kind of acknowledge that some guys do have that level of upside, and it's reflected in our upside tool. You can look at how many times a player reaches 2 times or 3 times their salary or whatever, and that's kind of the guy you want to target. These are guys, I mean, if you have a Diamondback stack and you didn't botch it at pitcher, you went Lester or you with the chalk, then you're more than likely going to make some good money just off that alone,
right?
No matter how bad the rest of your lineup is. So these guys, Tomas is a perfect example of a guy, like 7 multi-home run games is huge. And it's a guy who's on fire, which is another thing. I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of guys at this point in the season get a little bit streaky, kind of hitting their stride. I mean, Yasmani even like 3 weeks ago was awful. And like,
what about Ryan Howard or Freddie Freeman?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Ryan Howard's I don't know. He's not a good hitter, and he's like his average distance is like 290 right now.
Yeah, there are a lot of guys at this point in the season. It's hot. The temperatures are all hot. I mean, they're finding their swing. There's a lot of data that can back up that hot streaks exist. It's just hard to predict.
Yeah.
And I still think it's important to kind of look at these metrics we have, that the recent batted ball distance, the exit velocity, these things do matter. You look at Charlie Blackmon, who's just scorching hot right now. A lot of these guys are still under-owned in tournaments, and I think they're worth some exposure when a guy has 12 home runs in 19 games. He's pretty clearly seeing the ball well.
And hitting at Chase Field.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, his exposure was high.
Right.
But it's a reason players like him, similar to him, get on these power streaks, and I think you kind of want to take advantage of them at times.
Yeah, for sure. What did you think about the Rangers ownership? I mean, they were implied for it looks like over 5 runs, but their ownership in this monster was pretty low here.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, they were playing at 5.3. I think they closed that. So it was definitely interesting, but everybody was on the chalk, and they just kind of missed the chalk for multiple reasons. I mean, a lot of it was, DeShields was 21%. So I think that was more of a cash play than a tournament play. That probably would have been a guy I would have been fine fading with if I went Rangers stack. He did come through, though, with 18.4. But I think it's a great idea. I mean, he went with the Diamondback stack, which was chalky. You knew Lucroy was going to have high ownership just with the catcher pool, which you brought up earlier. One thing I wanted to ask you about is what you thought of the Elvis Andrus play a little bit in this lineup.
Right.
It kind of stood out to me. Like, was it more of just a positional thing, you think? I don't want to get too much into it because we don't know why he chose Andrus, but he had his 9th best game of the season. Hitting 8th, it didn't really have correlation to the other guys. Is this just an example you think of just kind of throwing him in at that price point?
Yeah, I don't understand the play. So people, I'm sure we'll have some commenters. I think our very first pod we did this, we said that we didn't understand some play, and we had a bunch of commenters tell us why it was good. It was some pitcher who just got off like a extended AAA stint in which he did well or something. Yeah,
he did well, and that actually sparked my interest in AAA statistics. And I did go look through a lot of pitchers who had a lot of success, and I didn't find anything substantial in
I think that was a results over process
a little bit, but I could, at that point you could see why someone chose him if you're looking at this dude just dominating AAA, but it's AAA.
And so I don't particularly understand this play too much. I mean, he's a guy who, if you look at his splits, he's got like a 191 ISO versus lefties. I mean, at 381 wall, but it's not awful. He was coming to the game, he was hitting a lot of ground balls. His ground ball percentage was up over 50%. I mean, it wasn't the most amazing play, but it was a high implied team total, and
I think it was fine. The more you look at the lineup and you have Weeks and Tomas in the outfield, you have to play Goldschmidt. So if you're doing a Texas stack, you're sort of going to have to take that shortstop position and fill it in with if you're filled with Arizona, or you forego that fourth Arizona player. So I still think it's interesting. I think one thing with Andrew is just forcing it probably, but he has been significantly better against lefties this season, registering a 21% upside against lefties compared to a 10% upside percentage against righties. So in that regard, facing a weak left-handed pitcher implied a lot of runs. I mean, I'm fine with it. I just thought it was interesting that it wasn't really correlated, and you'd think they'd go someone else at shortstop probably.
Yeah, but I mean, like if you look at like the other shortstop options, like you obviously wanted to get this stack in with Lester, and so it was either going like min price at either shortstop or second base, and I think that the options, like I think Tony Ronda was probably just as good of an option as anything that you were going to find at shortstop really anywhere that was going to be minimum price. There was a couple guys that were min price, but these guys like didn't really have any potential. And so if you're going to go, shortstop and then min price elsewhere, like at least like get exposure to the stack that you're in. So I think it was interesting. Like it may not have been like the best play in the world, but it kept the stack. It was exposure to a high implied offense there. Texas was implied for 5.3 runs. So like it wasn't just like a stab in the dark at a 8th guy on just a random team.
It's tough, man. Yeah, it really stood out to me. And he did go for 21.4. But what's really interesting too at shortstop is that he played 3 Arizona guys, and Chris Owings, shortstop, hitting 6th, was 2,800. So less than Andrew. So he could have just put Owings in there and got the 4 on Arizona's side. And that's kind of, I don't know if he missed that or if this was intentional, or he just didn't want Owings, who has good splits as well versus lefties. So I don't know. I guess that's something I want to know, but probably we'll never know.
Yeah, it's interesting. But, I mean, it sort of just speaks to the fact that you don't have to straight stack in these high implied offenses. We've seen that. Like, there's going to be upside plays in these offenses all throughout the lineup. The team's implied to score, 5.5 to 6 runs. Like the entire offense, if they go off for a lot of runs, is going to, have opportunities to score a lot of points. So you're going to get these guys at a much lower ownership. So, mixing up your stack is always an interesting strategy. And so, he's getting these Texas guys, and when I think he went 1, 4, 5, 8. So just exposure all over across the lineup. So you're not getting the correlation, but if you're, I think, sometimes we think correlation like it only is for batters right next to each other. But like if you're expecting a lineup to go off and like them score 6 to 7 runs in a single inning or something crazy like that, just crush a pitcher, like you're going to have a correlation across all those batters. Like you don't need to have the second and third guy right next to each other or something like that. Like this, you have a high upside and opportunities across the entire lineup 1 through 9.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something we've talked about a lot within this pod series is kind of not focusing on just basic 1 through 4 correlation of the highest teams. Coors Field, you stack 1 through 4. But we brought up a ton of examples of actual winning lineups and data that show that you can mix it up a little bit and kind of go against what should theoretically be the most optimal lineup. But everybody else has those same thoughts. And with baseball being so high variance, you don't necessarily need to fall into that every single night. So I think more than anything, this series just showed different ways to be contrarian and have success in these tournaments, and kind of like not a formula of how to do it, but specific examples of similar processes and strategies that you can incorporate in all of these different price tournaments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And, one thing that we've mentioned is sort of just like figure out what you believe in about the slate and take some stands in places. And I think we sort of saw this in the pitchers. Like I really believe that Lester and Yu Darvish were sort of in the tier of their own yesterday. I think they were to like really like the highest. Like I get there's some good pitchers in Carrasco and David Price, and even some Sanchez was fine. Like there's some interesting pitchers and some good ones right below them. But I thought just the matchups and the form that they were coming into sort of set themselves apart. So that's something where if that's something you believe in. Then you can just really load up on those two guys, and then just if you're going to multi-enter lineups, just filter in different bats around them and go heavy on those. Whereas the difference, and we've talked about these in some of our episodes, where if you don't believe in pitchers, and that's a good way to maybe go a little chalkier on bats and filter around a bunch of different pitchers and hope one of them has a nice game. But you sort of just have to take a stand depending on the slate, and I think this was a good one. We saw some of the best tournament players really recognize the fact that both Darvish and Lester were sort of in their own tier, and to really stick to that and then mix bats around them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, and we've covered it on all these pods, kind of similar strategies, and I think they work well for each type of buy-in. But at the same time, I do think with these higher stakes, you are probably playing a tougher field overall. So I think it's important, if you're finding yourself having a lot of success in the squeeze or a $3 buy-in, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to jump stakes.
No, if you're having success, keep on having success.
Keep doing it, yeah. Absolutely.
As long as you hate money, yeah. I mean, it is interesting, like if you're looking at the winning score, and this is just how things work. The winning score of the Monster is 279. The winning score of the Grand Slam, which the $25 was 310. The squeeze was 335. So that's sort of the distribution that you would expect. Since you have less amount of people, you have to be you don't have to hit as hard, and you're just competing against less people. So it is sort of it's not counterintuitive, but it's just a catch-22 is as you play against sharper players, you have to be less sharp, you think, because of the winning lineups. But it's tough just because there's just less lineups you can afford, so you just have to be sharper with your one play as opposed to throwing in 150 lineups and hitting on one of them.
Agree. It's a good way to sum it up.
Yeah. So any last thoughts on this one?
I think we got it all. I think we covered a lot of strategies for these tournaments and a lot of ways to take them down. Yeah,
I'm very happy with this series. I've always thought that it would be really cool to go through practically like what it looks like to take down tournaments, and we can talk strategy and do all sort of that in podcasts and in our content, but being able to like actually break down like what actually won this tournament, what actually won real dollars, I think was useful. For at least for us too, I think.
Yeah.
For no one else, but
yeah, definitely.
But it's been cool. It's been cool to get feedback and people saying that they appreciate it. So I definitely appreciate you guys listening for sure for this series, and we're going to tentatively end this here. But I think we definitely like the series, and it's something that we may have to bring back for NFL or even NBA or. It'll always be something on our mind, how to practically break down tournaments and in a way that I think will be useful for listeners. So definitely let us know your thoughts on this little series. And I guess thanks for listening these last 6 weeks. I thought it was good.
Yeah, thanks for listening, guys, and definitely good luck. Best of luck on the end of MLB season with these tournaments.
Yeah, it's in the grind of MLB, but we have NFL coming up and NBA not too far after. So it's going to be a good time of DFS coming up pretty soon. So, all right. Well, everyone, thanks again for listening. And we'll talk to you guys next time, whenever that may be.
Good luck, guys.